The fluorescent lights of the supermarket hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the neatly arranged aisles. The air was thick with the faint scent of disinfectant and ripe produce, mingling with the distant chatter of shoppers lost in their own worlds. It was late afternoon, the time when the store was just busy enough to feel alive but not crowded enough to be suffocating. Jamal preferred it this way, the rhythm of the everyday, the quiet hum of a well-stocked grocery store, the predictability of moving through aisles, picking up necessities without fanfare, was comforting in a world that too often felt anything but. Jamal was a tall man with broad shoulders, dressed simply in a dark hoodie and jeans. He moved with the quiet ease of someone accustomed to making himself small in public spaces, aware of the unspoken rules that governed how a man like him should navigate a place like this. Years of subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, experiences had taught him to always be cautious, to always exude a calm that could not be mistaken for aggression. He exhaled slowly as he reached for a loaf of bread, his fingers brushing the packaging just as another cart clipped his side. The impact was small, barely enough to warrant a reaction, but the sharp scrape of metal against plastic was jarring. He turned his head, expecting a quick apology, a sheepish smile, some kind of acknowledgement that it had been an accident. Instead, he was met with the hard, narrowed eyes of a woman who looked as though she had just swallowed something bitter. Karen, the type of woman whose presence was an unspoken warning in itself. Her perfectly ironed blouse, the stiff way she gripped her designer handbag, the way her nose wrinkled as she looked him up and down. Jamal had seen that expression before. It was the look of someone who believed the world belonged to them and who was offended by the mere presence of someone who did not fit their vision of it. "Excuse me," he said evenly, stepping slightly to the side to give her space. He had learned that sometimes even the simplest movements could be misinterpreted. Karen, however, did not move. Instead, she scoffed, her lips curling in thinly veiled disgust. "Watch where you're going," she said, her voice sharp, edged with a condescension that made his stomach tighten. Jamal clenched his jaw, inhaling deeply through his nose. He had options here. He could let it go, let her words drift away like so many others he had learned to ignore over the years. But something about the way she stood there, the way she expected him to shrink under the weight of her glare, made his muscles stiffen. "I think you ran into me," he said, his voice calm, measured. Karen's eyes widened slightly, as if the mere act of him responding was an offense in itself. Her grip on her cart tightened. "Oh, so now you're trying to intimidate me?" she said, loud enough that a few heads turned. Jamal sighed internally. He knew this game. He had seen it play out before. The accusation, the escalation, the inevitable performance of fear from someone who was never in any real danger. He took a step back, raising his hands slightly in the universal gesture of peace. "Not at all," he said, just pointing out what happened. But Karen wasn't interested in a rational conversation. She tilted her head, her expression twisting into something theatrical, exaggerated. "You people always think you can do whatever you want," she muttered, just loud enough for him to hear. The words settled into his skin like oil, thick and suffocating. His fingers curled slightly against his palm. He reminded himself that anger would do nothing here, that no matter how right he was, no matter how unfair the situation, he was expected to be the one who walked away. He forced himself to relax his shoulders, to exhale slowly. "Have a good day, ma'am," he said, turning back toward the shelves, willing himself to move past it. But Karen wasn't done. "Unbelievable," she huffed. "People like you always playing the victim, always making trouble where there isn't any." Jamal froze. The words were sharp, designed to provoke, and for a moment they succeeded. He felt the weight of them pressing against his ribs, the slow burn of something dangerously close to resentment simmering just beneath his skin. But he had learned a long time ago that his emotions were a luxury he couldn't always afford. So he swallowed them down, clenched his jaw, and reached for his shopping cart, ready to leave the moment behind. A few other shoppers had started to linger nearby, their gazes flickering between him and Karen, their curiosity laced with hesitation. He could feel the shift in the air, the invisible line being drawn, one that he was always expected to step away from first. He knew how this worked. If he raised his voice, if he let his frustration slip, he would be the problem, not her. Karen, emboldened by the growing audience, took a step closer. "I should call security," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "I don't feel safe." Jamal let out a slow breath, his fingers gripping the handle of his cart just a little too tightly. He had done nothing. He had simply existed in the wrong place at the wrong time in front of the wrong person. And yet, he was already being framed as the threat. It was a story as old as time, one he was tired of being forced to live through. A young employee in a red vest appeared at the end of the aisle, his gaze darting between the two of them, uncertain. "Everything okay here?" Karen's expression shifted in an instant. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, her eyes bright with the kind of righteous indignation only someone certain of their untouchable status could summon. "This man," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "has been following me. I don't feel safe." Jamal's stomach dropped. He could see it happening before it even fully unfolded, the whisper of suspicion in the employee's eyes, the way other shoppers instinctively took half steps back, as if distance alone could shield them from whatever danger she was conjuring out of thin air. For a moment, the weight of it all threatened to crush him. The exhaustion of it, the sheer absurdity. But then, something flickered in the employee's expression. Hesitation, uncertainty. Maybe he had seen enough of the exchange to question it. Maybe he wasn't so quick to buy into Karen's performance. Karen, sensing the moment slipping, let out a sharp breath and reached for her phone. "I'm calling the police," she announced. Jamal felt the familiar wave of dread coil in his stomach. He had done nothing. And yet, the moment those words left her lips, he knew how this could end. He had been here before, and he knew this was only the beginning. Jamal felt the weight of Karen's words settle in the air like a slow-acting poison, spreading tendrils of unease through the gathered crowd. He had seen this moment play out before, in countless viral videos and whispered stories passed among friends, but experiencing it firsthand sent a cold dread creeping up his spine. His pulse hammered against his ribs as Karen lifted her phone, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she hit the record button. Her voice, shrill and laced with forced hysteria, cut through the murmurs of the onlookers. "This man is threatening me. He won't leave me alone." Her eyes, wide with mock fear, darted between Jamal and the growing circle of strangers now pausing to watch the spectacle unfold. She stepped back dramatically, her breath coming in exaggerated gasps, as though she were moments from collapsing under the weight of the imagined danger she had conjured. Jamal didn't move. Any sudden motion could be used against him. He could already see the narrative forming, the way her performance would play on a screen to those who weren't here to witness the truth. A black man in a hoodie, a frightened white woman, the same tired story recycled endlessly, each time with new names but the same outcome. His hands stayed at his sides, open and unthreatening, though his fingers twitched with the need to do something, anything, to stop this from spiraling further. "Ma'am, I haven't done anything to you," he said, his voice steady but edged with exhaustion. "You ran into me. That's all that happened." But Karen wasn't listening. She didn't need to. The truth had never mattered in moments like these. The only thing that mattered was perception, and she was a master of manipulating it. She turned the camera toward herself, her expression the perfect blend of fear and righteousness. "He's getting aggressive," she whimpered. "Someone call the police." Jamal clenched his jaw, the frustration building beneath his skin like a rising tide. His breath came slower, deeper, as he fought to keep his composure. He knew how this worked. If he got angry, if he let even an ounce of his irritation show, he would become exactly what she wanted him to be, the aggressor. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people had already pulled out their own phones, recording from different angles. A woman in a blue jacket frowned, whispering something to the man beside her. The supermarket employee in the red vest shifted uneasily, his gaze darting between Jamal and Karen, unsure of what to believe. Karen saw the hesitation and doubled down. "Oh my God!" she gasped, her voice breaking. He just tried to grab me. Jamal's stomach lurched. His hands tightened into fists before he forced them to relax. He hadn't moved an inch, hadn't even stepped toward her. But he knew that the truth was already slipping from his grasp, being rewritten in real time by her trembling voice and the lens of her phone. "Hey, lady!" A man's voice called from somewhere behind them. "I've been standing here the whole time." That didn't happen. Karen's head snapped in the direction of the voice, her carefully constructed facade flickering for the briefest moment before she recovered. "You didn't see what happened before," she snapped. "He's been following me. She faltered, realizing she had no real story to back her claim. Her eyes darted toward the exit, as if calculating her next move. Then, as if deciding that words were no longer enough, she lunged. Jamal barely had time to register what was happening before he felt the sharp shove against his chest. Karen's small but forceful hands pushed at him, catching him off guard. He stumbled back a step, not because the force was overwhelming, but because of the sheer shock of it. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Karen, emboldened by her own reckless momentum, reached for the loaf of bread in his cart, yanking it free as if it were some sort of trophy. "You're stealing!" she shrieked, holding it up for all to see. "You were stealing, and I caught you." Jamal stared at her, his mind struggling to process the absurdity of what was happening. She was unraveling, grasping for anything to justify her escalating hysteria, spinning a tale so desperate that it bordered on the ridiculous. But he knew ridiculous didn't matter. People believed what they wanted to believe, and there were always those willing to take her side simply because it was easier than confronting the truth. The supermarket employee finally stepped forward, his face pale with uncertainty. "Ma'am, you need to calm down." "Calm down." Karen whirled on him, incredulous. "Are you serious? He attacked me. He's been harassing me. Call the police." "We did," the employee said, his voice hesitant. "They're on their way." Jamal exhaled slowly. The police. His heartbeat pounded louder. He had done nothing wrong, yet he knew how this could end. His mind flickered with memories. Stories of men who had been in his position and had not walked away unscathed. His muscles tensed, his body preparing for whatever came next. Karen, sensing her moment slipping, threw one last desperate move. She raised her hand as if to strike, as if she could manufacture the final piece of evidence she needed to seal the narrative she had built. But before she could make contact, someone else moved. A woman in the crowd, blonde, in a leather jacket, stepped forward, quick as lightning. Without hesitation, she pulled a small black canister from her purse and aimed. There was a sharp, unmistakable hiss as the burst of pepper spray exploded into the air. And then Karen was screaming. Karen's scream tore through the air, raw and piercing. A sound of pure, unfiltered agony. She staggered backward, clutching her face as her designer bag slipped from her arm and crashed to the floor, its contents spilling out in a disorganized heap. Keys, a wallet, an expensive-looking phone that skidded across the tiles. Her hands clawed at her eyes as she gasped for breath, her chest rising and falling in frantic, shallow bursts. The red mist of pepper spray clung to her skin, seeping into her pores, setting her nerves on fire. The supermarket fell into stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Jamal could still hear the faint hiss of the pepper spray lingering in the air, mixing with Karen's choked sobs and the hurried shuffle of feet as people instinctively backed away. The woman who had sprayed her, a tall, confident black woman in a leather jacket, stood firm, her expression impassive, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the small black canister. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't sorry. If anything, her stance radiated a quiet certainty, as if she had been waiting for the exact right moment to act. Jamal blinked, his mind catching up to the chaos unfolding before him. He had been prepared for many things when Karen started her performance. Accusations, humiliation, even the arrival of the police. But not this. Not the sudden reversal of power. Not the sight of Karen crumpling to the ground, a mess of tears and gasping breaths, no longer in control of the scene she had so carefully crafted. The woman with the pepper spray exhaled sharply, shaking her head in disgust. "Enough of this," she muttered, her voice laced with exhaustion. She turned to Jamal then, her eyes meeting his, scanning him for any sign of injury. "You good?" Jamal hesitated, still processing everything, before nodding slowly. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "Yeah, I'm good." Karen, still writhing on the ground, let out another strangled sob. I can't see," she wailed, her voice cracking under the weight of her own hysteria. "Somebody help me. That woman attacked me." She reached out blindly, her fingers grazing the floor as though searching for anyone to come to her aid. The crowd remained frozen, uncertain, their earlier curiosity now replaced with something else. Discomfort, maybe even guilt. They had stood by as Karen spun her web of lies, watched in silence as she pushed and accused and played the victim. And now, in the wake of her downfall, no one seemed to know what to do. Jamal swallowed the bitter taste rising in his throat. He had no sympathy for her, not after everything, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing realization that had things gone differently. Had that woman with the pepper spray not intervened, he might have been the one on the ground instead. The supermarket doors slid open suddenly, breaking the tension, and two uniformed officers strode inside, their hands resting near their holsters as they scanned the scene. One was a middle-aged white man with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression. The other, a younger black officer with sharp eyes that flickered between Jamal and Karen with quiet calculation. "Someone called about an assault?" the older officer asked, his voice cutting through the lingering murmurs. Karen, despite her swollen, red-rimmed eyes and streaked makeup, wasted no time. She pointed a shaking finger in the general direction of the woman in the leather jacket. She attacked me. I was just shopping, and she sprayed me in the face for no reason." The officer glanced at the woman, who crossed her arms and met his gaze without a trace of fear. "For no reason?" she echoed, her voice edged with skepticism. "Is that the story you're going with?" Karen's breath hitched. She must be working with him," she cried, pointing blindly in Jamal's direction. "They're trying to." "That's enough." The younger officer cut her off, his tone firm. His gaze swept over the scattered belongings on the floor, the way Karen's fingers still curled into desperate fists. Then he turned to Jamal, his expression unreadable. "Sir, what happened here?" Jamal took a steadying breath. He could feel the weight of a dozen unseen expectations pressing down on him. Say too little, and the truth might be drowned out by Karen's theatrics. Say too much, and he might be accused of being defensive, of making excuses. He chose his words carefully. "She ran into me with her cart," he said, keeping his voice level. "I said nothing rude, just pointing it out. But she started making a scene, accusing me of following her, of stealing. Then she tried to push me, took something from my cart. She was escalating. And when she went for me again, that woman stepped in." He nodded toward the woman in the leather jacket. The older officer frowned, shifting his weight. "And you're saying this woman?" He gestured at Karen, who was still hiccuping through her tears. "Initiated the physical contact?" "Yes," Jamal said, his stomach tightening. "Multiple times." The officer turned to the woman with the pepper spray. "Do you have anything to add?" The woman let out a short, humorless laugh. "Not really. I saw a white woman screaming at a black man, lying through her teeth, and when she looked like she was about to hit him, I did what I had to do." She lifted the canister slightly, as if to emphasize the point. "Didn't even use that much." Karen let out a strangled sound, part outrage, part disbelief. "This is insane. You have to arrest her." "Ma'am," the younger officer interrupted, his voice sharp now. "We have multiple witnesses, and from what I'm hearing, you were the one being aggressive." Karen's face crumpled. "No, she choked on her own breath, shaking her head wildly. "This isn't fair. This isn't." The officer sighed. "We'll review the security footage," he said, his tone making it clear that the outcome was inevitable. "But based on what I'm hearing, You might want to rethink pressing charges." Karen's mouth opened, then shut. Her body sagged slightly, realization dawning, cold and undeniable. The power she had wielded so carelessly, so confidently, had slipped through her fingers like sand. Jamal didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He simply watched as the woman who had tried to turn his life into a weapon against him crumbled under the weight of her own actions. It wasn't justice, not really, not the kind that erased the years of fear and careful maneuvering he had endured, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. Karen's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps as she sat hunched on the floor, her fingers still trembling as they hovered near her swollen, red-rimmed eyes. The effects of the pepper spray had lessened slightly, but the humiliation burned just as fiercely, searing through her pride like an open wound. The world around her felt distant, muffled, as if she were watching a nightmare unfold from behind thick glass. She had lost control of the situation, and worse, she had lost the sympathy of the crowd. The people who had once looked at her with concern now regarded her with a mix of wariness and quiet judgment. She could feel their eyes boring into her skin, their silent condemnation heavier than any words they could have spoken. Jamal stood a few feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his face unreadable. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't sneering or taking pleasure in her downfall. If anything, his expression was one of exhaustion. Of a man who had seen this play out before, who had braced for the worst and was simply relieved it hadn't ended with him in handcuffs. But there was no victory in his stance, no satisfaction in watching her unravel. The older officer sighed, running a hand through his graying hair before exchanging a glance with his partner. The younger officer was already speaking into his radio, his voice calm and professional, relaying details back to dispatch. Then, turning his attention back to Karen, he stepped closer, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stand up," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. Karen's lips parted, her throat tightening around an invisible grip of panic. "No," she croaked, shaking her head violently. "You don't understand. I was the one being attacked. That woman. She assaulted me. And that man." Her gaze darted toward Jamal, wild and desperate. "He was harassing me. I was just trying to defend myself." The officer didn't waver. "Ma'am, we have multiple witnesses, and we're reviewing security footage. Everything points to you being the aggressor." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And based on what we've seen and heard so far, you'll likely be facing charges for filing a false report and harassment." Karen's world tilted. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she processed what he had just said. "No, no, no," she whispered, tears spilling freely now unchecked. This isn't fair. This isn't how it's supposed to go." The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs. "Ma'am, place your hands behind your back." Karen flinched as the cold metal encircled her wrists, the click of the cuffs deafening in the heavy silence that followed. The reality of her situation crashed down on her in a suffocating wave. She was being arrested. Her face burned with humiliation, her mind scrambling for a way out, for some last-ditch effort to flip the narrative back in her favor. But there was nothing left. No one was coming to her defense. The bystanders who had once watched with morbid curiosity now stood in quiet agreement with the officers, their collective silence damning. Jamal watched the scene unfold with an unsettling sense of déjà vu. He had spent his whole life being cautious, moving through the world in a way that ensured he never found himself in a position like this, never gave anyone a reason to call him a threat. And yet, here he was again, standing in the eye of a storm he hadn't created, watching as a woman who had tried to weaponize fear against him was finally forced to face the consequences. It should have felt like justice. It should have felt like a win. But it didn't, because this wasn't new. Karen wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. And for every situation like this that ended with the right outcome, there were 100 more that didn't. 100 more black men who weren't believed, who weren't lucky enough to have a crowd filming, a stranger stepping in, a police officer willing to listen to reason. The weight of that knowledge sat heavy in his chest as he exhaled slowly, feeling the adrenaline begin to fade. He had survived this one, but it wasn't a victory. It was just another close call. The woman in the leather jacket, his unexpected ally, stepped closer, eyeing him with quiet understanding. "You good?" she asked again, her voice softer this time. Jamal nodded once. "Yeah." She studied him for a beat longer before shaking her head. "I hate that this even had to happen," she muttered. "But at least this time, people saw it for what it was." Jamal didn't respond. He wasn't sure if it mattered. As the officers guided Karen toward the exit, her panicked sobs echoing against the store's cold, fluorescent-lit walls, he turned away, pushing his cart forward, past the spectators, past the chaos, past the reminder of how close he had come to being another statistic. He had nothing left to say. The doors slid open before him, spilling him out into the crisp evening air. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs, grounding himself in the simple reality of the present. The world hadn't changed. He was still a black man in America, still moving through a system that saw him as a threat before it saw him as a person. But tonight, for once, the truth had won.